Welcome to Validity, Reliability, and Usability. I suggest viewing this PowerPoint in advance of reading chapters 4 and 5 in the Miller, Lynn, and Gronlund text. Getting a basic understanding of these important terms now should help when you read the text for the first time. Three important terms will be featured in this presentation. The first term, validity, refers to the appropriateness of interpretation and use of results. When it comes to validity, we often hear it said that a test is valid or invalid. In some ways, this isn't a proper use of the term because there's nothing inherently valid or invalid about a given test. It all depends on how a test is used. For example, a test designed to measure an individual's knowledge of electrical circuitry could be perfectly valid when given to an apprentice electrician. Yet using this identical test wouldn't be a valid use of the test for a teacher in training. Validity is often better thought of on a continuum from higher to lower versus just saying something is valid or invalid. After a fairly brief explanation of reliability and usability, I'll be explaining four specific considerations of validity. Validity, probably the most important assessment term, is by far the most difficult term to fully understand. This PowerPoint will help you start understanding the term. Let's look at reliability now. Not only do we want valid assessments, we want ones that are reliable as well. By this I mean that we want consistent results coming from our assessments. Let me use a scale as an example. First of all, we want a scale that is accurate, valid, and we want one that consistently measures weight, reliable. A reliable scale is one that gives the exact weight, say 175 pounds in my case, the first time one steps on the scale, and then the exact same weight shows again if one were to get off and then on the scale again multiple times after that. Not only do we want assessments that are valid and reliable, we want ones that are usable as well. The two factors affecting usability are time and expense. For an assessment to be usable, educators must be able to design, implement, and analyze results in a reasonable amount of time. Likewise, an assessment is only usable if it's cost-effective. As you design assessments as a part of this course and for your classroom, school, or district, it's critical to consider how much time and expense is required to do it properly. Like I said earlier, validity is the most difficult term to understand of the three presented in this PowerPoint. An assessment with a high degree of validity must first of all be content valid. In other words, it must adequately sample everything that was taught. For example, if I taught a geometry unit including information about points, lines, line segments, rays, acute, right, obtuse angles, it'd be important to have items related to each of these topics. An assessment with only items related to line segments and obtuse angles would not be content valid. The best way to think about content validity is to think about adequacy of sampling. For an assessment to be construct valid, it must measure what really needs to be measured. To explain this, let's think about two examples. Our first example will be for reading comprehension. For someone to really demonstrate competence in reading comprehension, all parts of the construct of reading must be assessed. In other words, a well-designed reading comprehension assessment would include items related to fiction and nonfiction text. It would include items designed to measure literal, inferential recall, and would encompass a variety of genres. An assessment wouldn't be construct valid if it only measured literal recall of biographies, for example. Let's consider a second example. At one point I taught backpacking skills in a camp setting. I could have taught about how to pitch a tent and then asked my 16-year-olds to pitch a tent, but that wouldn't have been construct valid instruction or assessment. To have construct validity, I would need to teach and assess skills related to packing a backpack, cooking, use of a compass, route planning, pitching a tent, etc. Now, a valid assessment needs to be content valid, adequately sample content, construct valid, measure what needs to be measured in the construct, and it needs to have a positive assessment criterion relationship. Let's consider two aspects of the assessment criterion relationship. First, a valid assessment given at some point in time should be validated by examining how a student does using that same skill set in a future event. For example, if a student scores fairly high on a pretest for admission to calculus, there is a positive assessment criterion relationship if he or she scores fairly high in the actual calculus class. If he or she doesn't score high in the class, there may be validity issues related to the initial pretest. The other aspect to consider in a positive assessment criterion relationship is that there will be a strong positive correlation between what the original assessment showed and what later assessments of the same content showed. For example, if a student scored low in your class on a writing assessment that you designed and then scored high on a district or a national writing assessment, there could be concerns about the validity of your assessment. At times, the actual assessment itself will have either positive or negative effects on the scoring. Some students, for example, become so nervous about an assessment that they freeze or panic during the assessment and can't think well enough to represent their knowledge. In this case, the assessment itself has a negative effect on the test score. Some students, on the other hand, rise to the challenge of an assessment and actually perform better than their ability would warrant. For these students, the assessment itself has a positive effect on the score. Whenever there are overly positive or negative effects of an assessment, then validity becomes a serious consideration. Having valid assessments is difficult. They must be content valid, construct valid, have a positive assessment criterion relationship, and not have overly positive or negative effects on the results. Chapter 4 of the Miller, Lin, and Gronlund text and the handout Validity will help you better understand validity considerations. The first forum post for this module will provide you an opportunity to explain the 4 considerations of validity.